The Curse of Abundance. A short, scary story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. I was going to say that it all started with a toothache, but that's not quite right. It really started the day before, with a decision. A stupid decision made with the sort of offhand nonchalance with which people like me make decisions about places like theirs. It was a bad decision, one that I regret to this day, and one that I probably always will. On the other hand, the decision to go to Greece in the first place had been a good one, though of course that decision wasn't really mine. It had been the run-up to exam season, and as the teacher with the highest number of exam classes in the school, and as a consequence the teacher with the highest number of mock examination papers to mark, by the time the half-term break came around, I was absolutely exhausted. For what seemed like months, I was either in the classroom teaching, planning the lessons I would be teaching the following day, or marking examination papers from one of the 4 exam classes, all of which had multiple papers for me to plough through. I lost count of the times that I had woken up, a stone-cold cup of ridiculously strong coffee beside me, slumped in the early hours of the morning over one badly constructed essay or another, having fallen asleep at my desk at home. Usually, the only thing that stopped me from sleeping right through the night in this position was Bella, my trusty golden retriever, who had herself become restless since her usual long walks on the moors by my home had been severely curtailed by my ridiculous workload. Partly to blame for this push paper mountain was Helen, my faculty head in the English Language and Literature department, who, having had her rather prodigious nose put out of joint by a younger and more dynamic teacher arriving on the scene and overtaking her in terms of popularity, had taken it upon herself to clip my wings by burying me under a mountain of paperwork and giving me the heaviest teaching timetable in the entire school. The other part of the blame lay with me and my stubbornness. I refused to allow this act of sabotage to affect my teaching, and in an effort to carry on to my usual standard, whilst also navigating the myriad pointless tasks I was given by Helen, I was working myself into the ground. A break was exactly what I needed. Luckily, a few days before the end of term, I received a phone call from my friend Claire, telling me that she had booked a week in Greece for the pair of us, and that no was not an option. Claire, who was also a teacher, and in fact the kind of head of faculty I would have loved to work under in the history department, had watched my victimization at the hands of Helen, and had decided to stage an intervention. When I protested her decision to book a holiday without even bothering to ask me, she simply laughed. "I can't go. I've still got a massive pile of mock exam papers to mark, and I haven't even started planning that Shakespeare unit for next term. I don't have the time," I insisted. Claire shook her head. "You get 2 weeks holiday. The papers and the planning will still be there waiting for you in the second week, but to be able to do your students justice, Christ, to do yourself justice, you need a damn break. So for the first week you are coming with me. No ifs and no buts. Unless, of course, those butts happen to belong to particularly attractive Greeks. Then I'll allow it." Claire was impossible to argue with, so I arranged for Bella to stay in a kennel for a week and skulked guiltily out of my apartment, glancing back at the monolithic stacks of paper that stood on my desk like some kind of stationery-based Stonehenge, and reminding myself, they'll be there when I get back. It was only when I arrived at the airport and saw Claire, suitcase in hand and massive grin on her face, that I finally started to forget about them and almost relax a little. As it turned out, the break was exactly what I needed. After a few days of sun, sea, and most of all sleep, I was feeling the best I had in months. The only slight issue was that I knew the sand, surf, and suntan style of holiday was already starting to get to Claire. A restless and curious soul, Claire had never been a fan of simply toasting on a beach. Her mind, it seemed, would not allow her body to stay still for that long in a single stretch, and after a few hours lying in the sun and periodically dipping into the sea, she became fidgety and anxious, wanting, in her words, to do something. By the third day, we had already agreed to separate for the majority of the day, me for a bracing day of reading and relaxing by the pool, and her to a hastily arranged field trip into the mountains to see some of the more interesting historical and religious sites in the area. a typical history teacher. We met up in the evening, and she regaled me with tales of all the fascinating things she had seen, whilst I listened, content to experience these wonders of the region vicariously through her explaining them to me whilst quietly sipping an ouzo and looking forward to another day of sunshine the following day. On the fourth day, however, Claire became insistent that by the end of the week I should join her on one of these excursions, and that if I didn't I would be missing out. Her pitch in convincing me to accompany her was suspiciously tailored to appeal to my personal tastes, but I agreed that on the final day of our stay I would come with her to Lithia. This village, which she had learnt about from one of the waiters at our hotel, was around 40 kilometres from where we were staying, and situated in a small valley. What made the village interesting to tourists, or at least those informed by our waiter — we could not find the place in any tourist guides — was its oasis-like abundance in a region that was not noted for its fertility. Indeed, the whole area, for miles around the village, consisted of the desert-like outcrops of volcanic rock and scrubland, punctuated by only a few sparsely distributed olive trees. Lithia, however, was a town known for its greenery and produce. Like a tiny pocket of fecundity, it was, according to our waiter friend and amateur tour guide, famous for its wine, which was supposed to increase virility in men and bring health and long life to women. "That is the legend. There are a lot of legends around Lithia," he had said with a beaming smile. The promise of myth and history to uncover was more than enough to sell Claire on the place, even before the smile, whereas her rave reviews of the most delicious wine I ever tasted were enough to convince me. As it happened, the village was very pretty and lived up to its reputation. Had Claire not already visited earlier in the week the drive out to the place, which incidentally involved taking 3 different local buses and a taxi that was essentially just the car of a local farmer and was far more effort than I would ever have invested in visiting a remote village, would have convinced me that the place was a myth. Whilst beautiful in its own stark sort of way, the relatively barren mountainsides, scorched by a sky of fierce and seemingly endless blue, did not seem to yield much prospect of decent wine, and for a few moments I did wonder if the place Claire claimed to have visited hadn't in fact been a mirage. When you arrive in Lithia, however, you know you've arrived. The entire small town of whitewashed walls and small narrow streets overflowed with a green abundance that seemed completely out of place in the area. Vines and leaves spilled like the hair of some goddess over every wall. Orchards full of apples and small groves of oranges, lemons, and limes were crammed into every available space. We passed farmers tending sheep in fields with grass so green and juicy with life that I was almost tempted to bend down and try some myself. Instead, I settled for wine. The place that Claire chose for us to sample the local beverage was halfway up a steep hill, itself implausibly covered with fields of parsley and what appeared to be tea, though I was sure that the area did not receive anywhere near enough rain to sustain such a crop. Claire led me to a small, battered-looking farmhouse, where an old Greek woman was sitting in the sunshine tending the fire with a large stick. The woman herself looked ancient, which I laughed to myself, at least gave some credence to the idea that the wine blessed drinkers with long life. She wore a strangely ornate garment, the like of which I hadn't seen worn by anyone in the surrounding villages, and had a strange turban-like head wrap on her head. Later, Claire would inform me that in this village some beliefs and practices still exist that are found nowhere else in Greece. One such practice, which had an exact parallel in the Yao women of southern China, was to only cut their hair once in their lifetime, usually on the occasion of their marriage. In China, the Yao women even keep the length of their hair removed during this single cutting and wind it up with their own, which is often well over 6 feet long, and is worn bound up into their head wraps. This woman, according to Claire, had adopted the same practice, and since she had never married, had over 80 years' worth of growth tied up inside her head wrap. How her neck even supported such a weight was beyond me. The other curious feature of this lady was her jet-black lips, painted, I was told, with a special mixture that contained extracts from the surrounding rock and charcoal. The effect was to make her remaining teeth stand out in contrast with a brilliant whiteness rarely seen in women of that age. All of this, though, was simply a precursor to the wine, which I have to admit was among the most delicious I have ever tried, having, as it did, a rich, fruity sweetness that reminded me of pomegranates flavoured with cloves. Having sunk a few helpings of this marvellous stuff, which was served in small copper cups, whilst seated by the fire with the old lady, I was beginning to feel that being dragged away from the pool wasn't so bad after all. Unfortunately, my pleasant consumption in the sunshine was interrupted by Claire's ever-present desire to see and do, and I was torn from my quiet contemplation of the wine's flavour in order to search for a spring, which, according to Claire, was central to some of the mythology in the area. The walk to find this place, based upon very sketchy directions from the old woman, took hours, and by the time we finally reached the place I was not only hot, sweaty and uncomfortable, but thoroughly regretting having had that third cup of wine. Reaching what appeared to be a small grotto, Claire became very excited and began snapping away with her camera whilst I plonked myself down on a rock and took some much-needed swigs of water. The clearing into which we had come was a small recess between two hills. The area had clearly been carved out and flattened for people to cram into the space before it. At the back of this space, carved into the rock itself, was a strange but indistinct statue of around 8 feet in height. It showed what appeared to be a woman wearing a horned helmet. To her left was a lion that she seemed to be not only keeping on a leash, but standing on with one foot. To her right was a pile of large egg-shaped objects, and seated in the corner, a rabbit or hare. From around the face of this sculpture, in place of what might have been hair, vines spread in all directions, winding up and over the rocks in every direction, coiling over one another and twisting into thick tangles as they moved further away. The effect was quite dazzling. The face and helmet were completely free from foliage. Whether this space was cleared regularly or not, I wasn't sure, but the appearance was that the greenery sprayed out from the face like rays in a child's picture of the sun, or the bright green legs of some great spider. The sculpture was impressive. Whether it was worth the climb, I wasn't sure, though of course Claire certainly seemed to think so. After around half an hour, during which Claire surveyed the entire area and took photographs from what seemed to be every conceivable angle, I was beginning to become bored. I kicked at the ground, ate an orange from one of the nearby trees, and tried in vain to maintain my interest. When another 10 minutes went by, Claire's assurance that she wouldn't be long now began to wear thin, and I contemplated wandering back to the village for another conciliatory cup of the famous wine. As I shifted in my seat, however, a small object by my feet caught my eye. I moved aside the soil with my foot, and after a moment bent down to dig it out. What I found was a small figurine of around 8 inches in length. In some details it resembled closely the statue, but in others it was wildly different. Clearing off the mud with my sleeve, I found that the carving was indeed of a woman, her hands resting on what appeared to be a pregnant belly. What was strange was that the convex protrusion of her belly was joined by 2 more on either side, as if she had 3 separate swellings. Likewise, rather than possessing breasts, the statue had what appeared to be a line of teats on the chest, more like those of a dog, each swollen and full with milk. The face, meanwhile, sported multiple rows of eyes that proceeded upward from the nose in a V-shape over the forehead and brow, whilst the hips were unusually wide. To say that it was an attractive sculpture would be untrue, but it was extremely interesting. Emptying a little water from the bottle onto it, I cleaned it up and opened my rucksack to put it inside. As I did, however, a cry came from the far side of the clearing. I looked up to see the lady with the black lipstick staring and pointing at me accusingly. Claire also turned to look at me. How the old woman, who had seemed somewhat unsteady on her feet, had managed not only to keep up with us, but to make it up the mountainside at all, was again beyond me, but she certainly did not seem pleased about it. She jabbed forward with her finger and screeched something at me in a language I didn't understand, but which I also did not think was Greek. Claire scrambled down from where she had been taking photographs and approached the old woman with her open hands raised. The woman, however, continued to point and shout. Clearly, she was upset that I had almost taken the statuette home with me and wanted to lay claim to it for herself. Still seated, I paused with it in my hand and raised it for her to see. This did not help, and instead only caused the pitch and volume of her wailing to increase. I tried motioning toward her, offering to place it in her hands and for her to take it. Still the wailing continued. Eventually, I rose from my seat and gingerly, with exaggerated care and reverence, placed the tiny statue back on the ground where I had found it. Finally, the old woman's noise decreased, and after what I took to be a few sputtered admonishments, she turned and began making her way back down the hill. "What the hell was all that about?" Claire asked blankly. I shrugged, a little hurt and feeling indignant at having been screamed at for doing God knows what wrong. "Are we not supposed to be here or something?" she suggested. "Is it the photographs? Maybe they don't like us snapping the statues." The brunt of the ill feeling had clearly been directed at me, and I had put my camera away a while ago. "Maybe," I said, slinging my rucksack over my shoulder and beginning the trek back down the mountain, trying as best I could to avoid the gaze of the old woman. A few hours later, back at our apartment, I was busy packing to leave early the next day and decided it would be amusing to play a joke on Claire. Padding barefoot across the marble-tiled floor, her body wrapped in a towel as she dried her hair, she caught sight of the figurine placed coquettishly on her pillow and froze. She dropped the towel she was using on her hair and turned to me accusingly. "You took it anyway?" she shouted, with little of the humour I had expected my little prank to elicit. I wondered if this was an act, a show of being appalled in response to my having left the thing suggestively on her pillow, and decided to push my luck with the joke. "No, I think it must have followed you home," I said, wiggling my fingers and whistling the Twilight Zone tune to underline the spooky goings-on. Claire snapped at me in a way I wasn't used to. "For fuck's sake, it isn't funny. She was clearly pissed at you for touching the thing in the first place, and then you just stole it?" I was a little taken aback by this and immediately became defensive. "I didn't steal it. I found it. The damn thing was half buried. I had to dig it up like some kind of archaeologist," I said petulantly, though in truth I knew that I had been very secretive when slipping the thing into my rucksack the second time, and had done so simply because I thought it would make an interesting souvenir. "That's not how it works," Claire began, but sensing that I had made a valid point, I pressed my advantage. "That's exactly how it works. Why do you think half the world's archaeological discoveries are in the British Museum? Because it was the Brits who dug them up. Finders keepers." "Are you serious? There are countries crying out for Britain to return stuff. It's literally the definition of stealing," she barked in reply. There was silence, as I stubbornly refused to admit that I had done anything wrong. Well, she isn't going to miss what she didn't know was there, and we're flying at 6 a.m, so I won't be going back there to replace it. What's done is done. Case closed, Your Honour. It'll get a nice new home on my mantelpiece. Claire stared for a second, wondering if I was joking, then, silently shaking her head, padded back into the bathroom without saying a word. By 9 a.m. the following morning, I had completely forgotten about the statue. Having queued for passport control, baggage check and security, and having waited an additional 2 hours for the delayed plane, I was more than preoccupied with my ill will towards the airline to worry about what I'd packed. Claire, too, seemed to have forgiven me for my indiscretion, and during our very rushed and meagre breakfast spent her time reminding me of the many highlights of the short week by the sea. The trip to the village was never mentioned. During the flight itself, I was far too distracted to think about it. I was in agony. I had experienced some problems with my wisdom teeth before, but this was toothache like nothing I had ever known. White, hot electric flashes that shot along the upper jaw on my left side and seemed to grip the hinge as if the bones themselves were trapped in the bite of a pair of pliers that was slowly being twisted. The pain seemed to come in two separate parts. At its base was the dull ache that radiated up into the cheekbone, under the eye socket and down into the mouth. Beyond and above that was the sharper, more pressing pain, as the nerve itself seemed to have been set aflame like the fuse to an explosive that, if it went off, might well crack my skull. At one point I thought the pain was going to make me vomit, and I rushed to the tiny cubicle that passes for a bathroom on planes. Spitting into the sink, I saw blood in my saliva and felt a second wave of nausea, and decided to overcome my reticence about speaking to strangers and ask the stewardess for some painkillers. She informed me that she was unable to give me any medication because of the possibility that any adverse side effects could then lead to a lawsuit against the airline. Luckily, an old woman sitting in the row behind heard my plea and said that she had some painkillers in her purse that I was welcome to. Lawyers be damned. I thanked her and downed the pills like they contained the antidote. They didn't. The pain continued throughout the flight and the journey home, to the extent that I had not been back in the country for more than 4 hours before I called the emergency dentist and booked an appointment for the following morning. At 4 a.m, unable to sleep because of the pain and I assumed the jet lag, I decided to get up and eat something. Opening the fridge in search of yogurt, the only thing I thought I would be able to manage to eat without chewing, and which I thought might have a cooling effect on the nerves, I was stopped in my tracks by a horrendous smell. In the door of the fridge on the top shelf, the eggs, stored in their specially made plastic sockets and purchased only that day, were all broken. A sticky, mucus-like mix of yolk and blood was streaked down the wall of the fridge, whilst from the top of each one a newly hatched chick, bluish-purple, with bulbous red eyes, was draped over the shattered shell, their minute bodies plastered to the shell surface with liquid, each one with its beak gaping open in a tiny, silent scream. I had heard of people warming eggs and chicks hatching from them in a 1 in a million chance, but for all 6 to hatch and inside the fridge? Hatch where the temperature was not high enough for them to survive once hatched, let alone warm enough to stimulate them into breaking through in the first place? It seemed ridiculous. Each egg had seemed perfectly fine when I had placed them in the fridge the previous evening. Retching, I cleaned the mess and wrapped the tiny bodies in kitchen towel and ditched them in the bin. The day to come also held surprises. In the dentist's chair, I told him about my troubles with my wisdom teeth, that the pain was in the same general area, but that it was like nothing I had experienced before. The dentist, a handsome man in his mid-40s, nodded at this and motioned for me to lean back and open up. After a few moments of prodding, he sat back with a puzzled look on his face and informed me that he would need to take an X-ray of the area. I reminded him that my usual dentist had X-rayed the area only a few weeks earlier and asked if there was likely to have been any change in such a short period. The emergency dentist nodded that he understood but insisted on an X-ray. He then wheeled a large piece of equipment into the room, after which he and his assistant left so as not to be exposed to the radiation I was about to be exposed to for the second time in almost as many weeks. He came back in with a puzzled and slightly perturbed look on his face. He flipped the plate up onto the screen and switched on a light so that I could also see the results. What he showed me was my jaw in profile, looking exactly as it had just over a fortnight earlier, but with a significant difference. Above the offending wisdom tooth were multiple white spots of various sizes that spread along the line of my teeth and up toward my cheekbone. Alarmed by these new additions, I pointed to them questioningly. "What are those things?" I asked bluntly. The dentist took a sharp intake of breath and, eyeing me cautiously, announced, "They're teeth. Around a dozen tiny ones. Your previous dentist didn't mention this in your last X-ray?" I sat up from the chair to get a closer look. "Mention it? It weren't there last time. I saw the X-ray," I protested. The dentist glanced knowingly at the dental nurse and then back at me. "With all due respect, even though they aren't mentioned in your records, these growths didn't just spring up in the last 2 weeks. Now, I've seen this kind of thing before, once. One part of the mouth, for whatever reason, decides that rather than simply growing a new tooth, it will grow a collection. You have a whole cluster up there in your jaw on the right-hand side, and eventually they are going to try to come through your gum. Some will stay dormant, but others will begin to sprout if we don't operate." I nodded and agreed to come back for a procedure in a week's time. In the meantime, the dentist pulled my wisdom teeth and gave me enough painkillers to knock out a fairly sizable horse. I thanked him and went on my way. I had taken the bus to the dentist's in anticipation of the fact they might want to give me drugs that would mean I couldn't drive home, but decided that I would walk home and give the pills time to work. By the time I reached home, the pain was just beginning to die down. However, the day's strange events were not finished. Turning into my driveway, I was fishing for my keys when my eyes caught sight of the garden. My hands went limp, and the keys dropped to the floor with a hard metallic clang. The grass in my meagre front garden looked as if it had not been cut in over a year. Hundreds of daffodils, bright yellow and forcing themselves forwards in every direction, crammed into every space not already occupied by stalks of grass that seemed to be sprouting like ears of wheat. How, I wondered, had I strolled past this without having noticed? Surely the pain was not that bad that I wouldn't have seen this. Even so, there was no way that the grass could have grown so much in the week I had been away. It was impossible. Entering the house, I began to wonder if the painkillers given to me by the dentist were affecting me in different ways. I glanced back out of the window to check that I wasn't hallucinating, and called Claire. An hour later, she was at the front door with Bella. Anticipating that I might be unable to drive because of the drugs, I had asked Claire to pick her up from the kennels. Dropping her off, Claire looked with a worried glance at the garden as if it was somehow indicative of me having let myself go due to overwork. I asked her to come in and explained that only a few weeks earlier I had paid a neighbour's son a tenner to cut it for me. "But that's impossible. There's no way." I shrugged and stroked Bella's head as she licked my hand. "Everything is impossible until it happens, I guess." I told her about my teeth and about the weird incident with the hatching chicks. Claire turned white. "What did you do with the statue?" I eyed her suspiciously, hoping against hope that she wasn't going to blame the strange occurrences on me having stolen the artifact from Greece. "Oh, for Christ's sake, Claire, I'm sorry. I'll donate it to a museum or something. Can you not just let it drop?" Claire was stone-faced. Her lips pressed together tightly, and for a few moments she sat in silence. Then, as if deciding suddenly to take the plunge and tell me what was on her mind, she began to speak. "When I got home last night, I decided to do some research about Lithia and that statue. Not just because I'm sad and have no life, but I was going to put the photos on Instagram, and if I mislabeled it, then you just know one of the smartasses in my department would be on it within seconds, calling me out for not knowing who it was meant to be." I nodded, more to indicate that I understood why she was looking it up than because I knew why she was bringing it up now. "Anyway, I couldn't find anything on the village at all. It must be one of those things that only the locals know about, that hasn't quite made it into the Lonely Planet guide yet." I nodded, reflecting that if she was putting it on Instagram, then it wasn't likely to stay that way for very long. I put in some other search terms, but the only thing I could find about the place was one mention of a weird little village on one of the travel forums. This guy talked about an 80-year-old woman who had never cut her hair and wore black lipstick. I nodded. That certainly sounded like my shouty friend from the village with the starey eyes and pointy fingers. "Her name is Mother Lana, and according to this guy, she's famous in the local area." I nodded again. "Well, she isn't someone you'd forget in a hurry." Claire did her best to raise a smile, but it faded far too quickly to be genuine. "The post said that if she was more well-known, she'd be in the Guinness Book of Records. She's 86 now, and according to people in the surrounding villages, she had her last child at the age of 74. I snorted at this, a derisory sound meant to stand in for a genuine laugh. "Well, that's bullshit for a start," I said. "Plus, I thought she'd never been married. Who is she, this Virgin Mary?" This time, Claire did not even attempt to smile. "It gets worse. According to this guy, she had her first child at 16 and was pregnant every year after that until she was in her 70s. There are 97 other people living in that village, all male, and all her sons. I stared at Claire, trying to assess exactly how much of this horseshit she was taking in. Her face was leaden and gave nothing away. If she was joking, then she had a hell of a poker face. You remember seeing any women when we were there, other than the old woman? I thought about the trip, the men tilling the fields, working in the orchards and picking fruit. At the time, I suppose I'd assumed that it was just a sexism thing, that the men worked in the fields whilst the women stayed at home with the kids. I also considered that this attempt to spin a myth could have been backwards engineered. The story about there only being men having been invented because the dude only saw men when he visited. Before I could suggest this, however, Claire had already moved on. Anyway, I did some research on the statue itself and... She paused and stared directly into my eyes with a look of genuine concern. And the one that you brought home with you. It turns out that Lithia is actually the name of fertility goddess in Greek myth, but not one who looks anything like the statues. I did some reading, and the closest thing I could find to the carving in the wall is Inanna. She's usually depicted with a horned helmet, standing on a lion and with wings. I nodded. That sounded about right and quite similar to what we saw. Thing is, Inanna was a Sumerian god. She was worshipped later by the Akkadians and Babylonians, but that was thousands of miles from Greece. It doesn't make sense. Then there's the eggs and the rabbit. They're associated with Ishtar, another Babylonian goddess, also a fertility symbol. She's the reason we have eggs and rabbits at Easter to show fertility. I frowned in what I hoped was a quizzical look. I thought Easter was about Christianity. I'm sure someone told me that once, I interjected. Claire raised her hands in a motion that said both, "Don't get me started on that topic," and "Don't interrupt me on this one," in a single movement. The thing is, that's another goddess, another fertility symbol. It makes sense that they would worship fertility gods in a place like that village, but to have elements of so many different gods in one place, so far from where they are actually part of the mythology, makes no sense. So what about my little friend? I said, referring to the statue that was lying in my rucksack beside the bed. The flippancy of the comment didn't sit well with Claire. That one I couldn't identify at all, but multiple pregnant bellies, multiple teats, and all those eyes? I'd say that has to be a fertility symbol of some sort. I nodded. The logic definitely made sense. What I did find was that people would bury figurines of local gods in these areas as an offering to make the ground fertile. In Lithia it clearly worked, or at least people think it did. That's probably why the woman was so pissed at you for digging it up. I sighed deeply and admittedly did start to feel a little guilty. What worries me, though, is that you took it away, Claire said with a sense of disappointed finality. I moved toward the kettle and, sighing to indicate my weariness with the subject, laid out 2 cups for tea. Claire, however, ignored the sighs and continued. What if it worked under the soil, but it works differently here? What if all this weird shit, all this abundance and fecundity is, well, fertility gone wrong? At this, I burst out laughing. I have a feeling that given the chance, Claire would have become angry at me. As it turned out, she didn't have the chance, as we were both interrupted by a hard, wet slap as Bella's head ricocheted off the floor. I had never seen a dog faint before, and I must admit I panicked. Leaping to her side, I simply shouted at her over and over in a bid to rouse her. Claire, on the other hand, was far more level-headed. She bundled Bella up and rushed her to the car. 20 minutes later, we were at the vet, Claire having called them on the way whilst I sat in the back and continued to panic. After taking her directly into the back, the vet asked us to take a seat, and for over an hour we waited patiently for news. When he re-emerged, the vet at first looked stern, but eventually broke into a smile. She's going to be fine. Unfortunately, we did have to operate, and she won't be up and around for a while. I stepped toward him eagerly, and after thanking him repeatedly for several minutes, finally got around to asking the question. What was it? I mean, what was actually wrong with her? Here, The vet became a little sheepish and shook his head. Well, in the first instance, the answer is pregnancy. I shook my head. I tried to explain that Bella hadn't been near a male dog long enough for that to happen, except perhaps at the kennels, and even then she'd been done. She was incapable of having pups. It was then the vet's turn to shake his head. Quite the contrary. He led us into a small room beside the waiting room and switched on a backlit screen. I had a feeling of déjà vu as an X-ray jumped into life. It was Bella, or at least her stomach ribs and spine, below which there was what appeared to be a mangle of tiny bones. I stared at the image, then at the vet. I've never seen anything like it. Not only was Bella pregnant, she was pregnant with over 35 individual pups. She hadn't begun to show because they were still in the early stages, but, well, if you had not brought her in when you did, he trailed off before adding, she would not have survived the pregnancy. I was stunned. Later that night, Claire and I took the tiny statue up onto the moors and buried it. It probably won't surprise you to learn that the place we buried it has become something of a tourist attraction, and there's now a whole legend about the magical orange tree that seemed to appear overnight, and somehow, in defiance of all logic, manages to grow and bear fruit on the moors in northwest England. I've never been back to that place and hoped, as we both did, that this burial and the tree would be the end of the story, but it wasn't. Around a month later, as I left the house on my way to town, I met my neighbour Tim coming in the opposite direction. His face was ashen. When I waved, he burst into tears. I walked over to comfort him and invited him inside to sit down for a moment and collect himself. After a few minutes, during which time I prepared tea, he managed to explain the cause of his outburst. His wife, my neighbour Marie, had died the previous night. She had passed away due to complications around her pregnancy. The doctors had told us already that she was pregnant with triplets. We thought it was triplets, but then she got so big, just so big. When we went to the hospital and they did the ultrasound, we thought it was triplets, but... I stopped Tim at that point, placing my hand on his, partly to reassure him and save him from having to go through the whole thing again, and partly because I already knew what he was going to say. This has been The Curse of Abundance, a short, scary story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2021 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.